My name is Mike Adams, and my psychiatrist advised me to keep this journal of my thoughts and feelings. I had just gone through a traumatic divorce and was having a hard time dealing with it. The doctor advised me to tell my story, including what I was thinking and feeling at the time. He explained that this would help me deal with the trauma. It helped, and after that, journaling became a daily habit. Let me start by saying that I feel like nothing more than a sad divorce statistic. I caught my wife, Carrie, cheating, and now I'm divorced. I suppose it should have mattered that her lover, my boss Justin Bosner, was blackmailing her. But it didn't matter to me in the slightest. I couldn't get the image of them having sex in my marital bed out of my head. Apparently, Justin had gotten my wife drunk at a corporate party I couldn't attend and took advantage of her. He took pictures and used them to get her to have sex with him several times afterward. I was also prosecuted because I beat the crap out of him and was arrested. Luckily, I had a great lawyer, my brother Tom. He was able to prove temporary insanity and I was acquitted. Then my former boss tried to sue me for damages. When the jury heard the whole story, they awarded me damages. But the judge told them they had no right to do so. So, taking the hint, I sued him. This time, the jury nailed him, and I was awarded a six-figure sum. I then sued our mutual employer for failing to comply with the morals clause in the employee handbook. I won a seven-figure sum. Financially, I came out of that mess fragrant as a rose, but I was still divorced and unmarried. Carrie was the love of my life. For 8 years, life was as close to perfect as a husband can expect from his wife. It was only by accident that I found out what my boss was up to. When Carrie's phone rang one day and she wasn't in the shower, I answered it. I simply said, "Hi," and the voice on the other end replied, "I can't wait to frolic in bed with you." I immediately recognized that voice as my boss. I was so shocked that I just hung up. A few minutes later, he called back and my wife picked up the phone. I could tell by the look on her face that she was upset by this call, but at the end of the conversation, she simply said, "Okay." That night, Carrie said he wanted to visit a friend. I replied that I didn't mind. We didn't have kids, so it wasn't a problem if either of us wanted to go out. I guess now I should introduce myself. I'm Michael Milbrook, an accountant at a medium-sized firm. Most people call me Mike. I'm good at what I do, but I can't say I like my job. My wife, Carrie, works as a hygienist at a local dentist. I think most people would say she's more cute than beautiful, but to me, she was the most beautiful person I've ever known. Of course, I'm biased. I loved her to bits when I first saw her. But after that phone call, I began to question whether I even knew my wife. Suddenly, she wasn't as beautiful as I thought she was. I began to doubt that anything in our 3 years of married life was real. At that point, I had to find out if she was really cheating on me. When my wife left that evening, I immediately got in my car and followed her until she stopped at a motel. I saw her go to the door and knock. When the door opened, I saw my boss there wearing nothing but a towel. He grabbed my wife and hugged her. She pushed him away but walked into the room. What could my wife possibly see in this guy? He was fat and bald. I waited about 15 minutes and then went to the door. I knocked and said in a fake voice, "Porter, there may be trouble in your room." A few minutes later, Justin opened the door and I stepped inside. I found my wife on one of the beds with no clothes on. Her eyes flashed with horror when she saw it was me. "Oh my God," she screamed. "Mike, things aren't what they seem. I didn't want to be here, but I had no choice." After that, I started bullying my boss. I jumped on him and immediately broke his nose. I then kicked him in the balls with my foot, at which point he passed out, curled up in a fetal position. I then knelt down next to him and kicked him in the face. When I was done with him, he looked like a piece of meat. I then turned to my wife, who by then was in shock. "You said you had no choice. Now you do have a choice to come home or not. I strongly advise you not to." With that final warning, I left the room and headed home. When I got home, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and drained it, then poured myself another and settled into a chaise lounge in the family room. About 30 minutes later, there was a knock on the front door. I knew who it was. It was the police. After ascertaining who I was, they handcuffed me and took me to the county jail. I had heard stories about how hard it was there. A sane person would have been scared, but I wasn't. I was still so angry that I didn't care about anything or anyone. Unfortunately, some asshole decided he was going to make me his bitch. I beat him up so bad he had to be taken to the county hospital. Luckily for me, there was a camera in the cell, and it clearly showed that another inmate started the fight. According to the police, I was just defending myself. I suffered 2 defeats that night. Both men I beat up had to be sent to the hospital. In Justin's case, they had to remove one testicle and weren't sure if the other would ever work properly. I was glad that this asshole probably wouldn't breed assholes to annoy women in the future. In addition to my boss losing at least one of his testicles, I also learned that I had cost him 6 teeth, a spleen, and a broken jaw that would cause him constant pain in the future. The funny thing is, I'm not a fighter. I am just over 6 feet tall and weigh about 170 pounds. However, when I was a kid, my father taught all of his boys how to box. But other than fights with my brothers, I've never been in a real fight. Despite all the pain I caused my boss, it was nothing compared to my pain. The woman I loved more than anyone in the world proved to me that she was nothing more than a fraud. Carrie tried to see her call me over the next few days, but I shut her out and tried to bury my pain. I didn't want to be hurt like that again. When my brother arrived, he brought me up to speed. He quickly bailed me out and then took me home to stay with him and his wife, Susan. They were very kind to me, but I was in so much pain that I acted like a total bastard. Finally, one evening, Susan took me aside and read me the riot act. "Mike, I know you're hurting, but my brother and I aren't the bad guys. If you're going to be a total asshole, you can go home to your cheating wife or get a hotel room." I apologized, and from that day on I started acting right again. My sister-in-law and my brother were my refuge, and I treated them as such. Tom filed divorce papers and filed a lawsuit against my employer at the same time. A few days later, my former boss sued me for the injuries I had caused him. Tom was smart. He succeeded in getting the lawsuit against me postponed until the criminal case was adjudicated. Once I was found not guilty by reason of temporary insanity, Tom turned his sights on my boss. Justin smirked as the trial began. He thought he was going to expose me. However, my former boss had no idea how deep my brother had dug for information. By the time the criminal case against me was finalized, Tom had found several former female employees of the firm who confirmed that Justin had done the same thing to them. And, as I said, when the trial was over, the jury wanted to award me damages. Of course, Justin was immediately fired, but that wasn't the worst of it for him. He was arrested for rape. The problem with the case against Justin was that there was no physical evidence. However, 6 women testified against him, telling the same story. I didn't follow the case because I was completely consumed with my divorce. I remember reading that he was found guilty of something, but it wasn't rape. It made no difference to me, except that he should have gone to jail. I know that Carrie was called as a witness and was practically present every day of Justin's trial. I remember that everyone was very disappointed that he only got 7 years. And even though it was proven that Carrie was the victim of the assault, I couldn't accept it. All I could think about was my wife and Justin in the same bed. So I went through with the divorce. I tried to look at it from Carrie's point of view, but I couldn't. If she had just trusted me and told me the truth, I would have dealt with Justin. But she didn't, and the fact that she went back for more made me think that maybe deep down Carrie liked what she was doing. The final divorce hearing was incredibly traumatizing. Carrie was there with her attorney, and she kept trying to leave me alone before the hearing. I made sure that didn't happen. Throughout the hearing, Carrie tried to catch my eye. The only time I looked at her, there was pleading in her eyes. But I was in too much pain to care. When the judge ordered our divorce, Carrie became hysterical. I ended up having to call an ambulance. I thought I would never see her again, but I was wrong. When the last lawsuits were finalized, I had to start moving on with my life. When all the lawsuits were settled, my fortune approached $3 million. And that's even after I paid my brother 30% of everything I was awarded. He didn't want to take it, but I made him do it. Now I was divorced and making good money, but what was I going to do now? I couldn't go back to my old job. They were unhappy with me, to say the least, and I didn't want to work for them anyway. By this point, my life was just floating along and I was still in pain. It was Susan who came up with the idea that changed my life, but for a long time I didn't know if this change was good or not. She suggested that I take a trip to Europe. She reminded me that I had always wanted to travel and now I had the means to do so. Of course, when I talked about it, I always assumed that Carrie would accompany me. If I were to go traveling now, Carrie would certainly not be with me. I started my journey in Italy. Everyone I talked to was enamored with the country. I was impressed with the historical sites, the wine was excellent, but overall I was disappointed. Next, I traveled by train to Germany. On the train, I met a lovely Englishwoman named Sarah Smythe. She turned out to be a good traveling companion and a first-class tour guide. Sarah was of pleasant appearance, with short blonde hair and soft brown eyes. She was petite, only 5 feet 3 inches tall, with a terrific figure, but what I liked best was her simmering enthusiasm for everything. It was a welcome change from the dreary existence I'd been in for the past 6 months. As it turned out, Sarah was a teacher at a school called Ludgrove. She pronounced the name as if I was supposed to recognize it, but it meant nothing to me. Nevertheless, I asked all sorts of questions about the subjects Sarah taught and about Sarah herself in general. I was a little surprised to learn that she taught math and science to children between the ages of 8 and 13. And I could tell by the twinkle in her eye that she loved what she did. Said that, as it seemed to me, Germany would have been a waste of time if not for Sarah. Sarah had a vast knowledge of World War II. I never had any interest in World War II, but Sarah brought the subject to life, and visiting the places where it took place was fascinating. Before anyone starts thinking that Sarah and I are having an affair, I'll dismiss that thought right away. When we first struck up a conversation, she informed me that she had just broken up with a longtime boyfriend. It had been a traumatic breakup, and Sarah didn't want to start a new relationship for a while. On the other hand, I was quick to assure her that I myself was not interested in finding a new girlfriend. I recounted my recent divorce chapter and verse. However, I was surprised by Sarah's sympathy for my ex-wife. I just categorized it as women protecting women, and left it at that. While I was by no means looking for a new girlfriend, I was surprised by the number of women who flirted with me. I thought maybe it was the fact that I was starting to look like a bad boy. It seemed like I always had a couple days of growth on my face. In addition, I let my hair grow longer than it ever had before. I assure you this was not done on purpose. It's just that ever since I stopped worrying about work, I've gotten lazy about taking care of my hair. However, the flirting wouldn't let me go, and I kept apologizing to Sarah for it. I felt bad because some of these women were flirting right in front of her, and she didn't know about our relationship. Sarah just laughed about it and even teased me when some woman would start making eyes at me. Though, to be fair, Sarah had just as many suitors and was just as embarrassed when they hit on her. I teased her back, of course. From Germany, I traveled to Sweden and Denmark alone. Sarah rented an apartment in Paris for 2 weeks and traveled there. I really enjoyed both of the Scandinavian countries I visited. The people seemed warm and friendly to me. Without Sarah, it was a little difficult to overcome the language barrier. She spoke 4 languages besides English: Italian, French, German, and Spanish. Nevertheless, even without Sarah, I was able to understand each other. By prior arrangement, I met Sarah at her apartment on the last 3 days of her vacation. Paris is a wonderful city, but I wouldn't give 2 cents for the people who live there. I know that's unfair, judging by the few people I encountered. But it seemed to me that Parisians have some deep-seated dislike for Americans. And Frenchmen seemed obnoxious to me. The attention Sarah received in other countries paled in comparison to the aggression of the French. One even sat down at our table during dinner and started talking to Sarah in French. This ended badly for the Frenchman when Sarah splashed a glass of wine in his face. He only laughed and threw me a caustic look. However, when I stood up and he realized I towered over him by a few inches, he finally took the hint and left. The second night in Paris, I took Sarah out for dinner and a walk along the Seine. It was a beautiful night and the moon was almost full. We stopped to watch the boats go by. For the first time since my marriage had broken up, I felt peaceful. "Sarah," I said, turning to her, "I want to thank you for everything you've done for me. You turned what could have been a miserable trip into something enjoyable. It was exactly what I needed." I leaned over and kissed her cheek. After a second, Sarah put both hands on my face and kissed me on the lips. Admittedly, I kissed her back. When we parted, neither of us said anything about the kiss. Instead, Sarah started talking about the history of the city and some of the landmarks we passed by. I went to bed that night embarrassed, but not unhappy. On our last night in Paris, Sarah cooked us a lovely dinner in her apartment. We sat on her balcony and chatted for hours, but then I reminded her that we had to get up early the next morning to catch our flight back to London. As I walked past Sarah's room on my way to the bathroom, Her door opened. She was wearing a beautiful white negligee. In the light from her room, I could see her beautiful body. She put her arms around me and kissed me passionately. I, of course, responded. Before I knew it, we were on her bed. I started to run my hand down her stomach, kissing her neck. But suddenly I stopped and stood up. "I'm sorry, Sarah," I said in a strangled voice. "I can't do this. It's too soon." I could see the disappointment in her eyes, but Sarah slowly stood up and hugged me. "I understand. It's just that I think I could fall in love with you." "You're a wonderful, beautiful woman," I assured her. "I'm just so confused, and the last thing I want to do is hurt you." "Ah, no." She kissed my cheek, and I went into the bathroom to get ready for bed. As I stood there brushing my teeth, I kept wondering if I had acted like a fool by turning Sarah down. The next day, we both said nothing about our meeting. When we landed in London, Sarah and I said our goodbyes and each left in our own cab. I thanked Sarah again for being such a wonderful guide, and then she kissed me on the cheek. Of course, before we parted, we exchanged addresses. We promised to write to each other, but I was sure that would never happen. However, I asked her to have dinner with me on the last night of vacation, and she agreed. I still had 2 more weeks left on my schedule, so I rented a Range Rover and decided to drive around the UK. I planned to visit a few major cities in England and then head to Scotland. I was told that the countryside there was very beautiful. I then planned to turn back south and visit Wales. I asked for a Range Rover because I was told that some of the roads in Scotland could be quite steep. At least that was my plan, but it wasn't to be. I cursed myself trying to find my way out of London the next evening. I lingered at the bank, trying to make sure I would have extra funds when I arrived in Scotland. Not only that, but I packed the power cord from my cell phone into one of my suitcases without noticing that the battery was dead. Instead of stopping to look for it in my luggage, I decided to use a paper map. This turned out to be a bad or good decision, depending on how you look at what happened. By the time I left the bank, it was closing time. I studied the card for about 5 minutes before deciding which way to go. However, an hour passed, and I was hopelessly lost. I had driven outside London but had no idea where I was. I stopped and asked for directions, but got even more lost. Frustrated, I pulled off the road I was traveling on and stopped under the foliage of trees. I remembered the names of the last few roads I had traveled and decided to look them up on the map. But after 20 minutes, none of those roads appeared on my map. I got out of the car, uttering unpleasant swear words, and walked back to the trunk, or as they say here in England. I started rummaging through my bags looking for the power cord when it came to me that I had left it in the hotel room. I felt like a complete ignoramus. I was in a foreign country with no phone and no idea where I was. While I was trying to figure out what I should do next, I decided to get my gun. Yes, I know it's illegal to have guns in England. And in fact, I think it's illegal to own a gun in most of Europe. But I'm an American, and I wasn't going to travel without protection. I carried a Ruger 9mm pistol with 2 magazines, each holding 18 rounds. I figured that would be enough for protection. You may be wondering how I was able to get the gun through customs. Actually, it wasn't that difficult. First, I disassembled the gun and then put the parts into special boxes I made myself. If they x-rayed my suitcase and saw what was inside those boxes, the strategically placed metal made the parts look completely different. For example, the barrel looked like a smoking pipe. All in all, I didn't have the slightest problem the entire trip. You might be wondering, if a gun is in pieces, how can it be useful? Usually when I traveled in the countryside, I kept the parts close by. In case of need, I could quickly reassemble the gun. So far, I hadn't needed it, and I hoped I never would. But now I was in the middle of nowhere and it was getting dark. I assembled the gun and loaded it. After collecting it, I slipped the gun behind my belt. Then I followed the road, wondering where it led. It looped until I saw a large, stately house on a hill ahead. Surely someone in that house could tell me where the hell I was. The road turned up the hill and led me to the back of the house. My heart dropped, as there were no lights visible on this side of the mansion. I turned off the car and started walking towards the house. I was just about to round the corner when I heard screams and 2 gunshots. Quickly looking around the building, I saw 2 men lying face down on the ground. The other man was holding a small boy with a hood over his head and kicking him furiously. The other 2 men were yelling at each other, and one of them was pointing at the 2 men lying on the ground. "You screwed up big time, buddy," the man yelled, pointing at me. Go back inside and make sure everyone is still locked up." Once the man disappeared inside, and the man struggling with the boy tried to put him in the car, I got out and yelled, "Drop your weapons and put your hands up." The man did not put his weapon down. Instead, he turned around and fired a lightning-fast shot at me. I returned fire. His bullet missed him, but mine hit him in the shoulder. He not only dropped the gun, but fell to his knees. The man holding the boy released him to see what happened. At the same instant, the boy rushed to run. The man rushed after him. I took aim at him, but the shot was weak. Nevertheless, it hit one of his legs. It knocked him down, but only for a moment. The man quickly got up and waddled in the other direction. Having gotten a temporary reprieve, I rushed to my car and started it. I stepped on the gas pedal and drove out from behind the building with a roar. As I sped past the kneeling man, he pulled out a gun. A few seconds later, he started firing. I figured he wasn't firing the gun, so I was perfectly safe. I was wrong. I felt a burn on the lower part of my left side, and when I reached out my hand, it was covered in blood. I had no idea how badly I was hurt, but I couldn't stop now. I rushed down the road and found a panicked boy running parallel to it. I stopped and opened the back door behind me. "Get in, boy," I shouted. "They'll be following us in a few seconds." Fear was written all over the boy's face, but apparently he figured I was a safer option than the assholes behind us. As soon as he slammed the door shut, I pedaled again, and we sped down the driveway toward what I realized was a house. "Hey, kid," I asked, looking at him in the rearview mirror. "Do you even know where we are?" The guy looked shocked and only shook his head. When I got to the end of the driveway, it was a 50-50th choice. Right or left? I chose left, a bad decision. If I went right, it would lead to the highway and there I could quickly find help. However, if I had gone left, I would have gone deeper into the countryside where there didn't seem to be any houses. I later learned that this area was home to some very large estates. There were literally kilometers between some of the houses. "Damn," I said out loud. "We're almost out of gas." The boy looked a little embarrassed, so I switched to British language. "Gasoline," I quickly corrected. "We're almost out of gas." "Oh, I say," the boy commented weakly. "This is terrible. What are we going to do?" I love British accents, and children's accents are delightful. In this case, however, his accent was the last thing on my mind. "I'll get off this road," I said, took a sharp left and rushed up the hill. Thank God I had a Range Rover. It made traveling overland a breeze. I didn't think the Mercedes I saw in the driveway would do the job. Checking the compass built into the dashboard, I told the boy, "I'm going to drive south because, for that matter, London is south of us." I looked at the boy again in the rearview mirror, and it was clear that he was scared but still in control. I gave him credit for that. Most kids would have been knocked down and freaking out by now. As we were rushing along, I asked him what his name was. The question seemed to startle him, but he stammered, George." "George, my name is Mike," I told him. "Now tell me what's going on." "Please, sir, what's your name?" My own name. This question threw me into confusion until it suddenly dawned on me what he was asking. "Oh, my name is Mike Adams." "Thank you for saving me, Mr. Adams," the boy said timidly. "I haven't saved anyone yet," I replied, and continued my question. "Where are we, and why were those men trying to take you away?" I don't know exactly," George replied. His voice was shaking, and I didn't want to push him too hard. I liked that he was showing as much self-control and courage as he had in him. "I was at my friend Peter's house at the weekend when these men broke into the house. They threw a bag over my head and one of them lifted me up. I don't know what happened to Peter, his parents, or their servants. It seems Peter's parents have money in this kidnapping. They may have taken Peter as well." I offered my perspective on the situation. "We should keep moving until we find help." We continued on through fields and streams, but found no houses or structures. All I could think of was to keep heading south. Eventually, we came to a road. We traveled over one hill, down into a field, and then up another hill. As we climbed the second hill, the car started to stall. I realized I was almost out of gas, so I found a bush where I could hide the car. When the car came to a stop, I opened the door and walked to the back. Lifting the back door, I pulled one of the suitcases toward me and began to inspect it. Not finding what I needed, I pulled the second suitcase toward me. After about 30 seconds of searching, I pulled out my flashlight. If you are British, that is a flashlight. I turned it on and searched the suitcases again. After about a minute, I found what I was looking for, my second magazine. George, listen, I said to the boy as I opened the door in front of him. We're going to have to make the trip on foot. I don't know if these people will realize I'm off the road, but we have to assume they will, and keep moving until we find help. Before heading out, I grabbed 2 sweaters, a wool hat, a large bottle of water, and a 4-pack of crackers. It was getting chilly outside, and I didn't know how long we would run until we found help. Besides, I didn't know what to do with the baby, but I was very hungry. I knew the car was pointing south, so I looked up at the sky and noticed a pretty bright star in that direction. I decided we could follow it. We walked for about 3 hours, stopping occasionally to rest and drink. We crossed several streams, but I didn't dare fill my water bottle. It was nearing midnight, and I knew the boy was exhausted. But despite the hard journey, he did not utter a word of complaint. We didn't talk because I didn't want to give away our location in case someone was nearby. Finding a bush, I sketched 2 mounds of leaves to make a bed of them. Then I told George to get some sleep. He didn't argue and in a few minutes was sound asleep. I stayed awake for another hour. The first thing I did was to check my wound. It was a deep cut along my left side where the bullet had crumpled me. The wound was still bleeding slightly, so I ripped off part of my undershirt and bandaged it as best I could. Then, I took one of the sweaters and put it on George. The other one I put on myself, after which I fell into a very heavy sleep. I was awakened by the first rays of the morning sun. When I woke up, I groaned. My side hurt like hell. Now I regretted that I hadn't brought ibuprofen with me. When I sat up, it woke George. When he got up, I asked, "How are you feeling this morning?" "I'm in a lot of pain, sir," he replied. "I'm in," I laughed. "Here, have some crackers." I tossed him the bag. While he sat and ate, I studied the young man. He was still scared, but he held himself surprisingly confident. I handed him water and another package of crackers, then I checked my wound and thankfully it was no longer bleeding. "I'm sorry, sir," George said timidly. "What's going to happen to us?" "We'll get help. Then your parents will pick you up and I'll continue my vacation. But first, I guess I'll have to go to the doctor to get some stitches." "You look awfully brave, sir," he said, looking at the ground. "I wish I could be as brave." "What are you talking about? You were very brave," I assured him. "Most kids would have bulged their eyes out." "But I cried, sir." He looked at me anxiously. "You won't tell anyone, will you?" "Look, George," I said softly. "It's okay to cry. Everyone cries at one time or another. Crying just shows that you care about something. There's no shame in it." "I just don't want people to be disappointed in me," George said, looking directly at me. "George, I'm going to teach you one of the most important lessons in life," I said with a smile. "There is only one person you never want to disappoint." George looked at me in confusion. "Who would that be?" "The only person you don't want to disappoint is yourself," I said firmly. "If you do what you think is right and give it your best shot, you don't need to apologize to anyone. And if someone tells you otherwise, tell them to back off." This made George laugh, and his mood began to lift. After gathering our meager belongings, we set off again. I was in a lot of pain, and I knew my wound was infected. I simply had no way to keep it clean. Besides, I no longer had a guiding star, and I wanted to stay close to the tree line rather than walking backwards through the fields. It was harder to walk than the day before, but we managed to hang on. We could see helicopters in the distance. I hoped they were looking for us and wanted them to head in our direction. By noon, we were out of water and I had no choice but to fill our bottle from the creek. I hoped there were no harmful bacteria floating in the water. Nevertheless, I decided that we needed to be found before any of us got sick. Night came and we still hadn't found any houses. I later learned that somehow we had managed to get between at least a dozen houses. If we had deviated just a few hundred yards to one side or the other, we would have spotted them. As soon as I found another bush and made beds, we settled down. Only this time there weren't as many leaves, and I was in a lot of pain. Plus, I was feeling a little under the weather and knew I must have a fever. The next day, we started again. Only now I could hardly stay on my feet. George's eyes were full of sympathy, uncertainty, and fear. I knew George still didn't trust me completely, but I just smiled at him and told him everything was fine. He didn't believe me for a second. Throughout the second and now third day, our conversations became noticeably livelier. I was no longer afraid of being overheard. We talked about many things, his studies, his friends, even a little about his parents. He didn't seem to want to talk about them, and I didn't insist. He said that his father and mother were very strict and expected a lot from him. I reminded him again that the only person he had to satisfy was himself. Toward noon, I began to burn with impatience. We had reached a place where we could not stay in the woods. We had to cross this field to move on. I told George that we would quickly cross the field and get to the woods on the other side. We were about 100 yards from the new tree line when I heard the distinctive sound of a diesel engine. I cursed to myself because it sounded like a Mercedes. "Run, George," I commanded, and started after him. I looked back just in time to see the Mercedes come over the hill and down into the field right at us. We had just reached a group of fallen trees when shots rang out. They were coming from the car that was coming at us. And we climbed over the fallen trees and I got into position. "George, listen to me carefully," I said, holding his right hand. "I want you to keep running. Try to get as far away from here as you can. But when you hear the shooting stop, find a place to hide, and don't come out until they're gone." "But Mr. Adams, what about you?" he asked with panic in his eyes. "I'll stall them as long as I can," I said. "Now be a brave lad and take off like I told you to." George seemed about to argue with me, but I pushed him away and he rushed off running. It was a good thing because the Mercedes was less than 100 feet away. They started shooting again. Only this time I fired back. I guess they weren't expecting that. In Britain, people don't usually have firearms. Anyway, the car skidded and came to a stop, flipping sideways. The men hid behind the car and started shooting. As far as I could tell, there were 5 men in the car and they were all armed. I found a spot where I could kneel down and have space between the trees to shoot. As I returned fire, I hoped like hell that George was keeping a huge distance between us. I was halfway through my second magazine when it happened. It seemed like the firefight had been going on for hours, but it had been less than 5 minutes. So far, I'd been lucky. The trees had covered most of the shots. But one bullet found its way through the branches and slammed into the right side of my chest. I was thrown backwards to the ground. It was 10 seconds or more before I could get to my feet. While I was lying there, one of the fighters decided to lunge at me. This was a bad mistake for him. I hit him in the center and he went down. I fired 2 more shots, but then I started to lose consciousness. At that moment, I heard a rumbling sound and a shadow passed over us. At that moment, I saw helicopters approaching us. Armed men were rappelling down the ropes, firing as they descended. Then I got very tired and closed my eyes. One day I woke up to a bright light and incredible pain. A woman immediately came to me and I remember someone saying, "We need to get him back to the operating room." Then darkness descended on me again. When I woke up the second time, I thought I was floating on something. The room was bright and there was no pain. A nurse in a matron's suit stood next to me and measured my pulse. When she saw that my eyes were open, she smiled. "Welcome back, Mr. Adams," she said in a delightful British accent. "It's good to see you among the living. You had us worried for a while. We thought we were going to lose you in a few moments last night. But the doctor thinks you've finally made it." My throat ached, but I had to speak. "Boy?" was all I could wheeze. "It's all right, Mr. Adams," the nurse said kindly. "Someone will be in shortly to talk to you." The nurse did not answer my questions, and this alarmed me. But I soon fell asleep. When I woke up again, I saw that it was night. After a while, an orderly appeared and fed me soup and helped me drink juice. There were IVs around my bed, and they were all being injected into me. I don't know how long I slept, but when I woke up again, it was already light. The doctor was standing next to the bed studying the chart. "A boy?" I wheezed my questions again. "Ah, Mr. Adams, you're awake? Good." The doctor smiled at me. "There is nothing wrong with the boy. However, I'm told he was very upset when you were brought in. He held you in his arms and begged you to wake up. He was covered in your blood, but otherwise unhurt. Is he a relative of yours?" I shook my head, but even that light strain tired me out and I fell asleep again. But apparently I didn't sleep long because it was still light out when I woke up. A few minutes later, a nurse came in and smiled when she saw that I was awake. "How are you feeling, Mr. Adams?" she asked. "My throat is very sore," I replied in no more than a whisper. "My chest and side are also sore." "I'll get you something for the pain," she said, and then added, "There are people who want to talk to you. Do you feel strong enough to do that?" I nodded. A gentleman of about 40 years old in appearance entered the room. He sat down in the chair next to my bed. He had hair the color of salt and pepper and a bushy mustache. His cheeks had a ruddy hue. Mr. Adams, I'm Inspector Blair from Scotland Yard. If I may, I'd like an informal statement from you. Of course, I said and was surprised that my voice seemed firmer. You have obviously been through a difficult ordeal, the inspector began. The doctors told me that things have been going your way for some time. They are still a little concerned about your infection, but fortunately you seem to be on the road to recovery. But I was wondering if you could tell me about your involvement in the incident last Monday. I shook my head slowly, trying to gather my thoughts. I'm afraid I can't tell you much. I have no idea what was going on. I think I stumbled into a kidnapping. Before I knew it, George and I were on the run. We spent days trying to find help, but we never found anyone. Then the kidnappers caught up with us. I tried to hold them off long enough for George to escape. The inspector smiled at me as if he knew a lot more about what had happened than I did. Well, that wasn't hard, since I knew next to nothing. Tell me, Mr. Adams, how did you end up in the exact house where the kidnapping took place? I got lost, I admitted with annoyance. I didn't charge my phone before I left London and tried to use a paper map, but all I managed to do was get hopelessly lost. I found a dirt road that led to the back of the mansion. I hoped I could get directions from someone there. However, as I approached the front, I saw that they were trying to kidnap George. I had my gun with me, and with it I freed the boy. We left in the car I had rented, but we were almost out of gas. When the car stopped, George and I had to walk. Like I said, we couldn't find anyone to help us. After that, I just tried to hold them off. How did you find us? Search teams and helicopters have been combing the area since the kidnapping was reported. One of the helicopter pilots spotted a car rushing down the slope and followed it. They came across your shooting and stopped it. Then you and the boy were taken to the hospital. At first, we thought the boy was badly wounded because there was a lot of blood on him. But as it turned out, it was your blood. He refused to leave your side. I told him he was brave, I replied absent-mindedly. What was it, Mr. Adams? Nothing, just that he was very brave. The inspector leaned back in his chair and smiled. That's an amazing story. It's true, I swear, I protested. If you don't believe me, ask George. Oh, I believe you, Mr. Adams. However, there is one point I would like to make clear. The gun you used to defend yourself with, where did you get it? I looked like a deer in the headlights. The phrase, "oh shit," flashed through my mind. I knew I was in trouble now, and at the same time, I knew that without this gun, I'd probably be dead. I brought it with me from the United States, I replied calmly. I don't think so, Mr. Adams, the inspector grinned. Bringing a gun into the United Kingdom is a crime. The gun we've found had the serial numbers wiped off, so you must have gotten the weapon from the kidnappers. You're very lucky, don't you think? My confusion was suddenly replaced by crystal clarity. The inspector was offering me plausible deniability about the gun. I was not the type to look a gift horse in the mouth. I quickly confirmed the inspector's assumption. Yes, that's exactly what happened. I caught one of the kidnappers off guard and was able to take the gun away from him. Excellent, Inspector Blair said, standing up. You know, I could do with a cup of tea. May I offer you one as well? To tell you the truth, Inspector, I'd kill for a cup of coffee. He laughed and said, I'll see what I can do. 10 minutes later, the inspector returned with an orderly who had a cup of tea and 1 cup of coffee. There was also a plate of cookies, which I believe the English call cookies. Mr. Adams, the inspector began, taking a sip of tea, I have a lot to tell you, and there's a lot we need to resolve before you talk to anyone else. So let me begin by correcting one of your misconceptions. The boy you know as George is actually Peter, and Peter is the future Duke of Windsor, and you will probably refer to him as the future King of England. However, the correct title is Future King of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. This information stunned me to the core. I couldn't think of what to say, so I remained silent. His Highness was spending the weekend with his friend George at Lord and Lady Ashford's estate. The Lord and Lady are George's parents. The guards consisted of 8 men. 2 of them were killed, 3 seriously wounded, the rest incapacitated. It was a well-planned, well-coordinated attempt to kidnap the prince. In fact, if you hadn't stumbled across this, they would have succeeded in kidnapping him, and we would have been left in complete ignorance as to what happened. Why these people tried to kidnap the prince, we don't know yet. nor do I have any idea how they knew where the prince was. That is something we will certainly find out. In the meantime, all I know for sure is that you're one hell of a hero. I mulled over the inspector's information, then weakly replied, I don't feel like a hero. In fact, I'm just a little uncomfortable. Should I call someone? The inspector asked. I shook my head. No, I'll be fine. Now we need to decide what to do next. The inspector took one last sip of tea and pulled out a notepad and pen. Rumors of an assassination attempt on the prince leaked out almost immediately. The country has been in a state of unrest ever since. Now that the prince has recovered safely, celebrations have been going on for days, both here and abroad. But it has also put almost all of Britain's investigative agencies under intense pressure to get to the bottom of what happened. I suddenly felt panicked because the whole incident resembled an act of terrorism. If it was, both my family and myself could be in danger. May I make a request? You can certainly make a request, but whether I can fulfill it is another matter. Could you please keep my name out of everything? I asked at once. Interesting, said the inspector, smoothing his mustache. Why do you want to do that? I just think it would be safer that way, I tried to explain. If it's the work of terrorists and I'm on the list of those who thwarted them, they might try to take revenge on me and my family. Yes, I realize that could be a problem, the inspector agreed. I will discuss it with my superiors and let you know in a few days. For now, we are keeping you in the dark. Are there people who might become alarmed if they don't hear from you? If so, we will contact them by making up a legend. Maybe my parents, I said after thinking for a moment. What day is it? It's Friday the 6th. I've lost almost a week, I said quietly. In a week, this Sunday, I have to fly back to the United States. I doubt I'll be released from the hospital in a week. It would be best if you would write to my parents using my account and just tell them I'm extending my vacation. We found your itinerary in your luggage. We kept an eye on the places you planned to stay to see if anyone contacted you. So far, no one has attempted to do so. Oh, another person you should know about, I said, remembering my obligation. I was supposed to have dinner with Miss Sarah Smythe on Saturday night. The inspector's eyebrows rose when I mentioned my participation in the dinner. And how do you know Miss Smythe? I met her on a train to Germany, I explained. We became friends and she became my unofficial tour guide. There was nothing romantic between us. She was just very kind and helpful. I understand, the inspector said, standing up. Do you have email for her? When I nodded, the inspector continued. I think we'd better email her and let her know you've been injured. You don't have any serious injuries, but you'd prefer to be treated by a doctor at home. In the meantime, there will be officers outside your room around the clock until we decide how to proceed. I'll contact you in a few days when we have a better understanding. In the meantime, I hope you realize that we will keep you incommunicado. That won't be a problem? I shook my head. The next few days were very difficult. As I got better, they started to reduce my dosage of pain medication. This meant that I was in pain at times, especially right after physical therapy. I started to get feverish from being in my room. At first, it was interesting to watch the television reports. There was a mood of grateful jubilation, especially in the UK. But there was also outrage. But after a day or two of non-stop reporting, it became painful to watch. I suppose I was suffering from a mild form of post-traumatic stress disorder. Just when I was beginning to believe that Inspector Blair had forgotten about me, he arrived the following Tuesday. I hoped he would give me some good news, like when I would be allowed to leave. I just wanted to get better and come home. I was standing at the window, wishing I was outside, when Inspector Blair walked into my room. You're looking remarkably well, Mr. Adams. I'm so glad you're recovering so quickly. That makes my news all the more gratifying. Sounds promising, I said, taking a seat on the edge of the bed. We're doing our best to get to the bottom of this dastardly attack. Unfortunately, we still don't know who is behind the kidnapping. However, we have managed to capture 2 of the perpetrators alive, and we hope that at least one of them will tell us what we want to know. Well, then my request is more pressing than ever, I replied. I hope you won't mention my name in every instance. You are an interesting man, Mr. Adams. Most men would like to boast the title of hero, but you wish to remain anonymous. Your primary concern is for your family, and that is commendable. But to reassure you, my superiors have agreed to keep you anonymous. We'll do everything we can to keep your name out of the public eye. I must admit that my superiors were in favor of releasing your name immediately. Some people in the department suspected you might have been part of a conspiracy. At first, they didn't believe your story that you just stumbled into a kidnapping. Some believed you were part of a conspiracy but chickened out at the last minute. However, a check of the tracking device on the rental car confirmed everything you told us. In addition, the prince insists you had nothing to do with the kidnapping. That's wonderful, I said with a smile. I guess that means I can return to the United States as soon as I'm released from the hospital. I can't wait to get home. Yes, you will be allowed to leave the country as soon as you are discharged, the inspector confirmed. We believe that the sooner you leave the country, the safer you will be. Have you received any messages from my parents? I asked. Yes, they have tried to call you and email you, the inspector confirmed. Naturally, we couldn't answer the phone, but we did let them know via email that you only have low cell coverage. I've spoken to the doctors and they'll discharge you in a week on Saturday, and we've taken the liberty of booking you on a flight leaving the same day. You will leave the hospital after lunch on the same day, accompanied by security. On Friday, when I was supposed to leave the hospital, the inspector appeared again and gave me back my cell phone. He said I could call anyone I wanted. I called my parents and told them I had been in an accident. I lied and said it was nothing serious, but I needed to go to the hospital. My mom was very upset and wanted to fly over to help me get back. I lied again and said I fell off my bike and had an unfortunate collision with some metal, but I was fine. I told her I'd be home before she could even buy a ticket. That seemed to reassure her. Saturday morning after eating breakfast, I got up and got dressed. I couldn't wait to leave the hospital and go home. At about 11 o'clock, I heard a noise in the hallway outside my room. When I looked out, I saw a well-dressed couple and a little boy walking toward my room. It took a moment, but then I recognized George, or as I corrected myself, Peter. As the couple approached, men and women on both sides of the hallway bowed or curtsied. It was unreal to watch. You read stories about how British royalty are treated, but you never expect to see it firsthand. The couple was very gracious to everyone they passed by. But Peter seemed nervous. When he finally saw me, he quickened his step and approached me before his parents did. Your Highness, I nodded with a smile. Mr. Adams, I'm so glad to see you in good health, he said with a wide smile. When they were lifting you into the helicopter, I was so afraid they had killed you. Thank you so much for helping me. By then, the king and queen were by his son's side. Your Majesties, I said with a slight bow, it is a great honor. No, Mr. Adams, this honor belongs to us, the king said, extending his hand, and we shook it. I couldn't believe that I was shaking the king's hand and would never be able to tell anyone about it. Oh well, I said to myself, all for the best. Mr. Adams, the queen continued, I cannot thank you enough for saving our son. It has been very hard on me since that incident. I shudder to think of what might have happened had you not been there. You will always be in our thoughts and prayers. The queen held out her hand to me, but quickly looked away when I took it, and then lifted my hand and kissed it. I was completely surprised by this act and didn't know how to respond. You can be proud of your son, was all I could say. He was very brave under very difficult circumstances. Without his help, I don't think we would have made it through. That was the end of the meeting, and they left. The royal family was warned not to make any noise around me. It might cause people to have doubts. A little later, I would learn that this visit was supposedly part of their royal schedule. However, they insisted on visiting the hospital and thanking me personally. I was touched by this gesture. All the time spent in the hospital had given me a lot of time to think about my life, and I wasn't particularly pleased with myself. The flight home still had me thinking about what to do next. My parents were there to meet me, and I could see the relief in my mom's eyes when her fears about my health were dispelled. Nevertheless, she hugged me tightly. Dad was also happy to see me home and hugged me too. I grumbled a bit and explained that my wounds were still a little sore. Nevertheless, I was thrilled to get a hug from him. It was something he rarely did. My dad always told people he didn't like hugs. That's not really true now. He takes every opportunity to hug my mom. As we stood at the baggage carousel, my mom became very calm and serious. Mike, I did something that you might be mad at me for, but please, if you're going to be mad at me. I can't think of anything you would do, Mom, to make me angry. Perhaps you'll change your mind very soon, Mom said, and looked toward one of the exit doors. I looked over to where Mom was looking and saw Carrie standing there looking confused. Her reddened eyes told me that she had been crying. Carrie looked pale and was trembling slightly. A few weeks ago, I would have gotten mad at my mom and left. But when you're as close to death's doorstep as I was, you start to look at life in a completely different way. Suddenly, a lot of things you thought were important no longer are. When I looked at Carrie, I no longer saw a cheating wife. I saw a woman who was lonely, sad, and scared. I also saw a woman who had been rudely taken advantage of and a woman who still seemed to love me. She was still the beautiful woman I had fallen in love with. I smiled at her and walked over to where she was standing. "Hi, Carrie," I said softly. "Thank you for coming to welcome me home." At that moment, Carrie's reserve broke and she threw herself into my arms. She sobbed on my shoulder, repeating over and over, "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me." I comforted her and then took her to where my parents were standing. They had already picked up my luggage. "I didn't like the food on the airplane, so I hardly ate anything," I said cheerfully. "What do you say I take you all out to dinner? I'm starving." I can't say that the relationship between Carrie and I suddenly improved, but it was a start. In the beginning, I had no idea what I wanted. All I knew was that I didn't want to punish Carrie anymore. I wanted her to be happy. A few days later, I took her out to lunch to discuss our problems. We then started going to counseling and finally started seeing each other again. From our conversations, I learned that Carrie was terribly afraid of disappointing me. That's why she agreed to the affair. I also learned that I had ingrained this belief in myself, showering my wife with praise when she did what I thought was good, and when she didn't meet my expectations, Carrie could see my disappointment. I never realized I was doing this, but looking back, I realized it was absolutely true. It took 6 months to resolve our issues, but I never stopped loving Carrie. So, in the presence of a small number of relatives, Carrie and I were remarried in her parents' backyard. Of all the people present at our remarriage, other than ourselves, the happiest, in my opinion, were our mothers. On our honeymoon, I took Carrie on a cruise. Oddly enough, Carrie and I didn't have sex before we were married. Neither of us wanted to stifle our emotions. So that first night in our cabin, we were both nervous. I know it sounds ridiculous because we had made love hundreds of times while we were married the first time, but this second marriage was very different from the first. I know that I, for one, felt connected to Carrie on a much deeper level. To me, Carrie was always the most beautiful girl I had ever known. She had long blonde hair and a button nose, but it was her soft brown eyes that drew me in the first time I met her that still captivated me. When I climbed into bed with Carrie, I could feel her trembling with anticipation. She smelled so wonderful, and she was even better to the touch. The rest of the honeymoon was very much like that first night. Sure, we went on excursions, went dancing, attended shows, but mostly we made love. I was in love with my wife again. But in the back of my mind, there was still a note of mistrust. It didn't come out until years later. I believe it happened that very first night, but 2 months later, Carrie found out she was pregnant. 7 months later, we had a baby boy, whom we named Grant. 11 months after that, we had a baby girl we named Louise. 3 years after that, Carrie went back to work part-time. At first, I didn't mind Carrie's new job, but I couldn't help it. With each passing month, my suspicions and jealousy grew. I kept my concerns to myself, but it was taking its toll on our marriage. Even though Carrie didn't do anything to make me worry, I still worried. At the same time, without realizing it myself, I was beginning to distance myself from my wife. I must have been mentally preparing myself for this because I couldn't shake the feeling that Carrie would betray me again. Carrie was suffering from my moods, and it was affecting her. We started fighting more and more often. Eventually, I began to think about divorce. It was Carrie who once again persuaded me to see a psychologist. At first, it didn't seem like it would do much, but gradually, I realized the hole I had dug for myself. After I realized my problem, our relationship became much better. Then we began to rebuild our relationship. For the next year, my family and I had a wonderful life. And then disaster struck. We didn't know that Justin Bosner had been released early from prison. During his time in prison, his hatred for me had grown exponentially. Carrie and I had just put the kids to bed when we heard several windows in the front of our house broken. I went to see what was wrong, and Carrie went to make sure the kids were okay. When I walked into the living room, Justin was standing in front of me, pointing a gun at me. "Well, Mikey, I've waited a long time for this moment," he growled. "I'm going to let your guts out and then have a little fun with your pretty wife. I'm sure she'll enjoy it just as much as she did before." I felt like ripping the asshole's head off, so I took a step forward, but he pulled his gun even more. "I wouldn't do that, Mike. I could stab you before you even get close to me. But I want this moment to last longer." At that moment, I saw a streak fly into the living room from the direction of the dining room. Carrie was clutching a gun, and Justin was trying to wrench it away. I jerked instantly, but the gun went off before I could pull it out. Carrie collapsed to the floor, and I slammed my fist into Justin's jaw, causing him to jerk backward and hit his head on the wall. Then I was on my knees, hugging Carrie. Her stomach was bleeding. I grabbed my phone off the coffee table and dialed 911. It seemed like hours had passed, but 8 minutes later the police and ambulance were on the scene. I grabbed a towel to press it against the wound. I remember crying, "Please hold on, Carrie. Please don't die." Carrie lay in my arms and looked down at me. "You're the only one I've ever loved. Thank you for taking me back. Take care of our children." Then her eyes closed. They never opened again. The hospital staff worked tirelessly to save her, but the damage was too great. I was completely out of my mind. Thank goodness we have two moms. They moved in with me and took care of everything while I was away. It took losing Carrie for her to finally realize that I was her one true love. I know I was at the funeral, but I don't remember anything. I only remember thinking that I should be the one dead, not Carrie. Justin was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Before his trial, he killed himself in jail. I was angry that he got off so lightly. It took about 3 months, but I was finally starting to come out of my depression. The main reason for my recovery was my children because I had to be strong for them. They missed their mother as much as I did. But, as children should, they recovered quickly. I didn't know if I would ever recover on my own, but they hoped I would be a support for them. For Carrie's sake, I couldn't let them down. But I was still flawed, and no matter how hard I tried to hide it, my mom knew it. In the end, she was the one who suggested I leave with the kids. I resisted at first, but eventually agreed to let us return to the UK. My parents and Carrie's parents agreed to come with me to help me with the children. By this time, I was no longer worried about returning to England. About 18 months after the kidnapping, Scotland Yard uncovered a plot to kidnap the Crown Prince. It turned out that the plot was hatched by a very small splinter group of anti-kings. There were only 30-odd people in the group, but 2 of them worked at Buckingham Palace and had access to the royal schedules. Most of the group didn't understand what their leaders were doing, but they all received prison sentences of varying lengths. But the ultimate plan was to kill the Crown Prince. After the divorce, I invested the money from the settlement agreement. By this time, the amount had grown to almost $5 million. So I decided to make this trip extravagant and booked first-class tickets for everyone. I booked a room at the Langham, one of the best hotels in London. Then I made sure to book a passenger van because I wanted to complete my tour of Scotland and Wales. I didn't realize it, but there was a circus unfolding in London, and I was to be at the center of it. When I spoke to Inspector Blair and asked that my name be removed from all records, I assumed that the records would be sealed forever. However, the records were not sealed permanently. They just sealed the records for 5 years. If the case remained unsolved, the seal was extended. It took another year before someone asked to open the records to the public. Finally, the request was granted. I asked that my name not appear on all the records, but it did not happen. My name was on all the reports. Even as we flew back to the UK, a few very persistent reporters were going through the reports. If I had the slightest idea of what was about to happen, I would never have gone. I would have moved my entire family to a shelter and stayed there until things subsided. But I had no idea. So I prepared for a trip that I hoped would help me heal my soul from the loss of Carrie and the guilt I felt for not fully trusting her love. As I was sorting through my suitcases and packing for this trip, I discovered Sarah Smythe's long-forgotten phone number. I was sure the number was no longer in use or was being used by someone else. Nevertheless, hoping it might be her number, I called. If I could get in touch with her, maybe I could convince her to join our tour. In any case, I felt I still owed her a dinner for the one I canceled when I fled England over 6 years ago. I was pleasantly surprised to find that the room actually belonged to Sarah. I was even more pleased that she immediately remembered who I was. Sarah told me that she was very disappointed that I had to cancel our dinner meeting. However, Sarah also assured me that she understood exactly why I had to do it. I felt a little guilty that I couldn't tell her the real reason, but it was a chapter of my life that was better left in the past. We talked for a good 2 hours. I can only imagine what my phone bill will be when I get home. Nevertheless, it was a very enjoyable conversation. I have a few friends who are so close that we can go months without talking, and when we do, it feels like no time has passed at all. That was the case with Sarah. And gradually, we told each other about our lives over the past 5 years. Sarah was happy when I told her that I had remarried Carrie and that they had 2 children. Sarah told me that she was still teaching at the same school, but now as an assistant principal. She had only been married for a short time, about 2 years ago. The marriage had been a failure, the divorce had been particularly nasty, and her ex-husband was extremely embittered. It was obvious that Sarah's failed marriage was still bothering her. So I finally told her about Carrie's murder and my attempts to rebuild her life. After I told her about Carrie's death, there was a long silence, and for a moment I thought Sarah might have hung up on me. But then I heard her sobbing on the other end of the wire. "Oh, Michael, I'm so sorry for you," she said in a shaky voice. She always addressed me by my first name and rarely by my nickname. "Nevertheless, you have children. I know that seems like a faint consolation now, but in the years to come you will realize how truly blessed you are." At first I didn't know what to say in response, but then, with a half-joking, half-serious grin, I said we should leave the sad stories in the past. Sarah agreed and began telling me about funny incidents that had happened to her students. I was grateful for the humor, but eventually got to the true purpose of my call. "Look, I know it's last minute, but I'm about to come to England with the kids and their grandparents," I explained. "I'd like to be able to tour a little bit. If you get a chance to free up, I'd love it if you'd join us." "Oh, I'd love to do that, Michael, but I can't get free right now. We're only in the middle of the semester, and I have so many meetings I have to attend. I'm really sorry." "I understand," I said, but I couldn't hide my disappointment. "But look, I still owe you for dinner from last time. Maybe you could free up an evening to have dinner with me?" "I'd love to," Sarah immediately replied. "However, you must promise to bring your children and their grandparents. I'd love to meet them all." "Wonderful," I said cheerfully. "I'll call you when I get to London and we'll work something out." As I said, even as we flew across the Atlantic, secrets that I'd hoped were locked away forever were about to come out. We flew early in the morning, and I knew the best way to beat jet lag was to stay awake until it was time to go to bed in a new place. If you do that, you'll be synchronized to the new time zone the next day. Since the kids slept for most of the flight, they were ready to travel. My parents and Carrie's parents were not thrilled with this plan, but agreed because I insisted. As soon as we were checked into our rooms, I called Sarah and made dinner arrangements with her for the next night. We then set off to explore London. We visited the Tower of London, took a boat ride on the Thames, and visited Legoland in Windsor. We all had a great time, but that was all about to change the next morning. That night I went to bed happier than I had ever gone to bed in a long time. I was looking forward to our excursion and looking forward to dinner with Sarah. The next morning I woke up to a heavy knocking on my room door. I had booked a 2-room suite for the kids and me. The kids were still asleep in one of the bedrooms as I hurriedly pulled on my pants and shirt. Stumbling, I walked to the door and opened it. Standing in the doorway was a solidly built, elderly, middle-aged man with a newspaper under his arm. "Sorry to intrude, Mr. Adams," the man apologized. "My name is James Butterman, and I am the manager of this hotel. I sincerely apologize for disturbing your sleep, but I urgently need to speak with you." Still half asleep, I gestured for the man to enter. Behind him, a waiter wheeled in a cart with juice, tea, coffee, and plates. Mr. Batterman told the waiter to bring the cart in and set everything on a table in the corner. Once everything was ready, the waiter left. Mr. Batterman immediately poured me a cup of coffee, which I gratefully accepted. "I think you should sit down, Mr. Adams. There's some news I'm sure you're completely unaware of." As soon as I sat down, Mr. Batterman spread a newspaper in front of me. The headline read, "Prince Peter's Child Abduction Mystery Solved." Below the headline, but still above the fold, was a color photograph of me. I quickly flipped through the article and groaned. My thoughts were scattered in different directions. But first and foremost, I was thinking about how to protect my children. When I reached the end of the article and realized I was completely exposed, I looked up at Mr. Batterman. How bad is it? I asked. Right now, hundreds of people and dozens of media members are crowding outside the hotel, hoping to see you. Apparently, word has leaked out that you're in London and staying here. The TV stations have been talking about you all morning. I expect the crowd outside the hotel to grow. I've already asked the police for crowd control. Simply put, Mr. Adams, you've become a media sensation. All of Britain wants to know everything about you. My mind was a complete mess and I still didn't know what to do. But then I suddenly thought I knew why Mr. Batterman had visited me. I suppose you want us to be accommodated elsewhere? Oh, good God, no, Mr. Batterman said with an expression of horror. I have come only to inform you of what is happening and to assure you that we will do everything we can to protect your privacy. It was only when Mr. Batterman uttered the word privacy that he pronounced it as prua ake. What do you suggest I do? I still didn't know what to make of this confusion and was more than a little intimidated by it all. And this was only my first introduction to the unfolding madness. It only got worse as time went on. I would personally suggest that you and your family stay at the hotel, at least for this night, Mr. Batterman suggested. Hopefully, things will calm down and people will eventually lose interest. I'll contact my office and see what they have to offer. The only problem with your plan is that we are scheduled to have dinner with a friend at Padella's restaurant. Mr. Batterman thought for a moment, then offered a solution. May I suggest that you invite a guest here and have dinner at the Grove downstairs? It's a 4-star restaurant with 46 seats, so it will be quiet and private. I told Mr. Batterman that his suggestion was excellent and I would cancel my reservation at Pedals and make a new one at the Grove. Please let me take care of that for you, he offered, and I agreed. I was still in shock at what was happening. Besides, I hadn't even seen what was going on outside yet. Mr. Batterman, can I ask you a question? I hoped he could help me make sense of it all. Sure, I'll answer anything I can. Why is this so important now? I asked. I mean, the kidnapping happened over 6 years ago. The police may have fudged the details a bit, but what does it matter? The prince was rescued, and he's safe and sound. Mr. Batterman studied me for a while, then smiled good-naturedly. Mr. Adams, you are an American, so to your people our royal family is more of a gimmick. But to those who are truly British, the monarchy is the foundation of our country. The entire country was stunned when word got out that the crown prince had been kidnapped. The whole of Great Britain was plunged into fear and grief. However, when he was rescued, the nation rejoiced as one. If you recall, news of his safe return sparked 3 days of celebrations. And now you have learned that you, sir, saved the prince and that you did not seek recognition for your actions. You have touched a nerve and evoked the gratitude of this nation. All I can say is that every member of my staff considers it an honor to serve you in any way we can. In addition, I want you to know that you will not be charged any fees for your stay at the Langham Hotel. No, I can't agree to that, Mr. Batterman, I immediately protested. Our being here is already causing you and your staff a lot of inconvenience. Mr. Batterman held up his hands. If it satisfies your sense of justice, I spoke to the main office this morning, and they're thrilled with the free publicity. Already orders are up over 18%. When Mr. Batterman left, Grant and Louise came out of their bedroom. The breakfast left by Mr. Batterman included bacon, eggs, bagels, and danishes. There was also oatmeal. I prepared plates for both of them and sat them down in front of the TV. I ordered the movie Toy Story for them. It was their favorite movie. Then, it was time to make some phone calls. The first thing I did was call a family meeting. I woke up both grandparents and asked them to come to my room as soon as possible. After that, I called Sarah to tell her about the change of plans. When I called her, she picked up the phone on the first ring. Michael, I can't believe what I'm seeing on TV. Is any or all of it true? Unfortunately, it's all true, I confirmed. I'm sorry I haven't been honest with you, but the truth is that I wanted to put all of this behind me. And that's why you canceled our dinner date with you? Sarah said in a voice that sounded both questioning and affirming at the same time. Yes, I'm sorry I deceived you, I apologized. But the British government agreed with me that it would be best if I left the country quickly and quietly. Is what they say of your injuries true? They say you almost died. Are they not exaggerating? No exaggeration. It's all true. But it's no big deal. I wanted to divert from the subject of myself to the subject of dinner that evening. Michael, this is a big deal, Sarah protested, and I thought she was angry with me, but she wasn't. I mean, you had to go through this whole ordeal alone and then come home and see your wife get killed. At this point, she started to cry. Please, Sarah, don't cry. There's nothing wrong with me. I just called to see if you'd mind if we ate at the hotel tonight, all things considered. I understand if you don't want to come. I mean, there's a total frenzy going on here because of the media. I'll definitely be there tonight, Sarah said immediately. There's no way I'm letting you cancel another dinner because of me. I'll see you at 6. When my grandparents arrived, I just laid out the papers, then took them to my room and turned on the TV. The news was talking about me all over the wall. I was beyond excited. As I looked out the window onto the street in front of the hotel, I saw hundreds of people. The police had set up barricades, moved people across the street, and kept them from moving. The whole scene was surreal. When my mom read this story, she suddenly cried. This day was getting worse and worse. What happened, Mom? I asked anxiously. You almost died, but you never told us about it, she sobbed. I'm sorry, but I thought it was best to keep it a secret in case terrorists were behind the kidnapping. I didn't want them coming after anyone else in my family. And when it turned out they weren't terrorists, I didn't see the need to revisit the past. I'm not sure my mom liked my explanation, but she accepted it. We met in my hotel room before heading downstairs for dinner. Sarah looked amazing, and my parents were very curious about her. She charmed them easily, and soon they were laughing at her stories about being an assistant principal. The dinner started off very awkwardly. The whole restaurant stood up and applauded when we walked in. Then people started coming up to our table to introduce themselves and thank me. I just smiled and introduced them to my family and Sarah. As people continued to approach our table, Grant finally turned to me and asked, Dad, are you famous? I guess so, I replied, but I don't want to be. It was at dinner that Sarah gave me the first good news of the day. After explaining who I was, the school board had approved a 2-week paid vacation for her. Sarah would now be able to come with us and be our tour guide. The only question now was whether we would be able to make the trip. In the middle of dinner, Mr. Batterman came to our table. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but may I speak with you, Mr. Adams? I apologized and followed the hotel manager to a quiet spot by the door to the kitchen. There, he looked around to make sure there was no one within earshot. Mr. Adams, I've contacted our main office, he began, and I was afraid we were about to be asked to leave. They have a pretty good offer. They think you might be able to cut down on the press hype if you hold an impromptu press conference tomorrow. We could hold it in our ballroom. Of course, the decision is yours alone. I ran that suggestion through my head a few times, and I liked it. I think it's a great idea. What do I need to do to make it happen? Mr. Batterman smiled and shook his head. Absolutely nothing. We'll work it out. I suggest 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. You will need to report in whatever clothes you are wearing. You should prepare a short statement and then we'll give the press 30 minutes for questions. My parents and in-laws were very impressed when I told them about the press conference. My kids didn't care because they were waiting for their cake and ice cream. The next day, I admit I was scared to death. I had never done anything even remotely similar. Besides, I've never liked public speaking. At 9:55, Mr. Batterman ushered me into the main ballroom. I was stunned by the transformation. American flags and British Union Jacks covered the back wall. Red, white, and blue garlands were hung throughout the room. The hotel band was positioned to the right of the podium with American and British flags crossed in front of them. As we walked toward the podium, I noticed that hundreds of people were gathered in the hall, and TV cameras were set up all around the hall. My legs felt like jelly as I walked down the center aisle. Suddenly, people started to stand up and clap. When I reached the entrance, the sound was deafening. My family followed me, and they were pointed to seats near the entrance. My children's eyes widened and they looked around the hall in utter amazement. My mother and mother-in-law had tears running down their cheeks. When they were finally seated, my children bounced in their chairs, asking their grandparents one question after another. As we climbed onto the hastily constructed platform, the orchestra began to play The Star-Spangled Banner, followed immediately by God Save the King. Mr. Bannerman stepped to the microphone and thanked everyone for coming. He then gave a brief introduction. I wrote a short speech but immediately put it aside. I figured I would just brush it off and let everyone know that I was grateful and humbled by this outpouring, but felt very unworthy of it all. Then the questions started. They wanted to know everything that had happened. One of the first questions was how I knew where the prince was in order to rescue him. I confessed that I only found out that he was the prince afterward, in the hospital. I then explained that I was hopelessly lost and was hoping some kind person would point me in the right direction. This drew laughter from the stern journalists. They were particularly interested in the details of the shootout. I talked a little about it, but spent most of the time thanking the SAS who had actually saved us. As I pointed out, if they hadn't arrived, I would be dead and probably the prince too. After Mr. Batterman thanked everyone for coming, the reporters kept asking questions as I left. I did my best to answer everything I heard. Thankfully, I quickly left the ballroom and went back to my room. My kids were all around me talking about all the people who had come to see me. The grandparents were over the moon with excitement. Of course, when I planned this trip, none of us expected anything like this. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the door. When I opened it, Sarah was standing there smiling at me. I hugged her and thanked her for coming. She laughed. As they say in America, wild horses couldn't keep me away. Michael, you were marvelous. I was sitting in one of the last rows, and I've never heard the press so enthusiastic about anyone. They're usually pretty edgy and looking for the next scandal. But they love the way you try to put the blame on everyone else. They especially liked it when you talked about your deep respect and admiration for the prince and how courageous he was. As I said, you were magnificent. The next day, we were all invited to Buckingham Palace, even Sarah, which really surprised me. It was during this visit that I learned something very unique about Sarah. First of all, she was a close friend of the Queen. They went to school together. The second thing I learned was that her real name was Lady Sarah Smythe. Her father was a duke. I blacked out when Sarah started explaining her family history. It was just too complicated. Finally, the next day, we went on a field trip. The government provided a car with 2 security agents to keep us safe. Security was not offered. It was required so we could go on the tour. It seemed to me that the whole thing was a waste of those security guards' time, but Sarah was happy to be guarded, so I didn't make a fuss. Our first stop was Manchester. I've always been a huge soccer fan. I even played on my high school team and an intramural team in college. Manchester United has always been my favorite professional team. I was hoping we would get to see the field before we went on a tour of the city. The Manchester club did a much better job of that. When they found out I wanted to see the field, they organized a small reception at the stadium. There, they took me out onto the pitch with my family and Sarah. I even got to meet a few of the players. I was stunned at how nice everyone was to us. Our next stop was Liverpool, and thankfully it was a relaxed visit. Since our schedule was kept private and the royal family had asked the press to respect our privacy, we fitted in and had a great time. From Liverpool, we traveled north, stopping wherever Sarah thought we might like. Perhaps because she was a teacher, Sarah had a wealth of information. It was much more fun to have someone who understood the history and significance of each place we stopped. We arrived in Glasgow and then Edinburgh, which we decided to make our base. From there, we could take day trips anywhere we wanted to go. Once again, we were free to move around. The initial excitement had subsided, and I was yesterday's news. I was very happy about it. There is no way in the world I could understand why anyone would volunteer to be a celebrity. During this tour, I discovered that Sarah is not only a great tour guide, but I am absolutely fascinated by her. My parents and even my parents-in-law quickly fell in love with Sarah, and the kids were crazy about her. We started out as casual acquaintances, and now we've become close friends. And one evening, as Sarah and I were taking a walk, I discovered that my feelings for her were much deeper than that. We stopped to look at Edinburgh Castle, and then, on impulse, I leaned over and kissed Sarah gently on the lips. She looked at me in surprise and then wrapped her arms around me and kissed me passionately. We went back to her room, but I didn't know what to do next. Fortunately, Sarah had some ideas of her own. She quickly started undressing me, and I, taking the hint, started undressing her. Naked, we both slid into her bed. As we lay there looking at each other, she said, "Please don't hurt me." "I'll be very gentle," I assured her. "No, that's not what I meant," she said with fear in her eyes. "I know you like me, Michael, but I'm desperately in love with you. I'll still sleep with you, but if it's not serious, please tell me." I'll be hurt, but I'll break if you lead me on. Sarah, when Carrie died, I thought I could never love another woman, I said softly. You've shown me that I was wrong. I can't promise a happy ending, but I love you and I feel so comfortable and at peace when you're around. That was all Sarah wanted to hear. After that, she turned into a wild woman. She couldn't seem to get enough of me. At first, our lovemaking was wild passion, but then it became slow and gentle. At 2 in the morning, I slipped out of bed and went back to my room. I didn't want my grandparents to know what Sarah and I had been doing. I was fooling myself, however, because the next day at breakfast, they were smiling and grinning at both Sarah and me. Pretty soon, the tour was over, and we were back in London. I asked my mom to watch the 2 kids, and Sarah and I had the opportunity to spend our last night together. The day we left was filled with hugs, kisses, and tears. I think Sarah was afraid that when I came home I would forget about her. But that didn't happen. In the months that followed, I talked to her every day and sometimes several times a day. The kids loved it when Sarah called because she always had some funny and fantastic story to tell them. Finally, I couldn't stand it any longer. Flew to London and asked Sarah to be my wife. She, of course, said yes. We then went to talk to her father, who I found out was the Duke of Stirling. Sarah's mother had died a few years before. The Duke of Stirling, or Percy as he asked friends and family to call him, lived on the family estate. The house was huge and the grounds were substantial. Sarah explained that farming covered most of the expenses, but not all, so the Duke opened the ancestral home for tours. The money from these excursions covered the difference, and the Duke had more than enough to live on. "So you want to marry my little Sarah?" asked the Duke with a smile. The Duke asked with a smile. "Yes, sir. Very much I do," I replied. "Do you know that her brother Edward will inherit the title and estates?" he asked, as if that might have bothered me. "Not only that, but her title will die with her. It cannot be passed on to any of her children." "Sir, let me assure you that I don't care at all whether Sarah has a title or not," I replied with a smile. "I love her, and I want to make her happy. I know she will be very happy if you give us your blessing. However, with your blessing or not, I intend to marry Sarah if she agrees to marry me." The Duke grinned. "That is an excellent answer. I give my blessing with all my love." The wedding was modest. Still, it was larger than I would have liked. About 100 people were present, including the king and queen. Peter was also there with a beautiful girl. He was already a teenager and was soon to marry and produce an heir. My father was best man and both my children were part of the wedding party. Sarah and I honeymooned in Bermuda and then flew back to the UK. We decided that we would live in England during the school year and America during the summer vacation. Grant and Louise were enrolled at Ludgrove School. As far as I know, this was a school that many royal families sent their children to. Sarah also adopted Grant and Louise. When we lived in the UK, the Queen asked Sarah and I to do some royal duties from time to time. These were visiting the sick in hospitals, visiting various schools, or opening new factories. Each time we performed these duties, Sarah and I were warmly welcomed. Admittedly, I didn't really believe it at first, but Sarah always made sure that these outings were fun for me. And every time she rewarded me for it in the bedroom. Wherever we are, whether in the UK or the United States, Peter keeps in touch with us. When he made an official trip to the United States, he wanted to stay with us, but his guards refused to consider that option for security reasons. Peter has grown from a scared little boy into a very confident, dynamic, and charismatic young man. I could not be prouder of him if he were my own son. 2 years after the wedding, Sarah gave birth to a baby boy. She insisted on naming him Michael Jr. A year later, we had a baby girl and we named her Charlotte. 18 months after that, another boy came along. We named him Thomas in honor of my father. After all the pain and horror, my new life was so different but so loving. I felt truly blessed. Our 5th wedding anniversary was approaching and we decided to celebrate with dinner and a show. I bought Sarah a gold necklace with 3 heart-shaped gold charms with each of our children's names and birth dates on it. I hope she likes it. Sarah, I'm trying to finish Michael's journal for him. On the night of our 5th anniversary, we went out to dinner. There, Michael gave me a gold necklace that I now wear every day. I was so happy and overwhelmed with love for my husband. I wasn't thinking about the play we were going to see. I was only thinking about what we were going to do afterward. As we were leaving the restaurant, I heard someone yelling at me. When I turned around, I saw my ex-husband who was drunk and holding a gun. He was yelling, "If I can't have you, no one can." The moment he fired, Michael pushed me away. Instead of the bullet hitting me, it hit Michael in the middle of his chest. All I remember afterward was screaming for someone to help us. Michael was in the hospital for 3 days. I was by his side the whole time. On the evening of the third day, when he opened his eyes, I was so happy to have Michael with me again, but he had just gathered his last reserves to tell me one last time that he loved me. Shortly after that, he died. It had been 2 months since I last wrote in Michael's journal. I thought I could do it, but I didn't have the energy at the time. I'm afraid I'll have to retype his journal because my tears smeared the ink and crumpled most of the pages. I am still struggling with the loss of Michael. Our children are suffering too, and I have to be strong for their sake. My ex-husband was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. The news of Michael's death hit the people of the UK and the US very hard. Flags were lowered to half-staff. Since Michael was a veteran, he was buried with full military honors in his hometown. To my surprise, the King and Queen attended the funeral. Peter was there too. He tried his best to be brave, but broke down when the coffin was lowered into the ground. In a rare display of emotion for the royal family, the Queen hugged her son as he cried. Now I have to pick up the pieces of my life. It was very hard, but Michael had left me one gift that I hoped would help me get through it. That night at dinner, I told my husband that I was pregnant again. I had a baby girl and I named her Mary after my mother. She has Michael's eyes and his smile. I have to stop because it's time to feed Mary. All I can do now is try my best for my children, especially because I know that's what Michael wants me to do. Lord, give me strength. I still love and miss him very much. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, so subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.